Continuing our conversation with Gordon Chang, one of the high points of our week here at Securing America. We're always delighted to have a chance to visit with him, but especially at what he describes as perhaps the worst moment in history, arising as a result of this axis between Russia and China and how it's working out for both of these countries at the moment. Gordon, this is a piece that you filed at the Gatestone Institute, where you are, I believe, a senior distinguished fellow. Give us a sense of what you're talking about and why it is emerging at this time.
Just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine and continuing through now, we have heard Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang all at the same time make threats to use their nuclear weapons in an offensive capability. I mean, every country views their nukes as deterrence. But now we're starting to hear these countries say, well, look, we'll use them first and we'll use them in an offensive capability. It started now. China's been making these threats throughout this century, but what is really disturbing is that these countries are doing it all at the same time, and that indicates a breakdown in deterrence. And of course, nothing good ever happens when that occurs. But I think it's because
Yes.
they look at the United States and they believe that they can actually maybe even use their weapons. This is inconceivable, but right now, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, which was for most people inconceivable, we're seeing a breakdown in international order. And so we could see war spread from Ukraine, both east and west across the Eurasian landmass, perhaps to North Africa. This is something where it's not just Russia and China, it's also their proxies as well.
Indeed. And notably Iran, which is at the cusp of having nuclear capabilities as well. Gordon, I was interested in something you said. I had thought that the Chinese, throughout this century, had basically been demurring about nuclear weaponry and never countenancing the idea that they might use it first. They were persuading people in the West that they had very modest ambitions, a stockpile of just a couple hundred weapons that would be a sort of minimal deterrent. But you're saying that they've actually been threatening in the past the use of nuclear weapons. Just elaborate on that if you
Yeah,
would, please.
this goes back to the first decade of this century, where we've heard Chinese generals threaten the United States over Taiwan, basically saying,
Yeah,
"You don't want to lose Los Angeles." And
right.
these are threats
Would you trade Los Angeles for Taipei?
Taipei.
Right.
And these are
Yeah.
threats that clearly indicate that they would use their nuclear weapons first. They would use them in
Right.
a conflict which was conventional at the time. So this undermines their no first use policy, which they talk about all the
Mhm.
time. But we have
Right.
we have heard these threats continually, and they're not just from flag officers. They're also from
Mhm.
Communist Party media. For instance, in 2013, we heard a threat to kill hundreds of millions of Americans. It was a coordinated media campaign, which means it came from the top of the Chinese political system. And we've heard these threats as recently as March, where the Chinese
Yeah.
military threatened the quote unquote worst consequences for any country that came to Taiwan's aid. This followed a series of threats against Japan and Australia last year. But what is, I said, concerning is that now it's Russia, China, and North Korea making these threats
Mhm.
all at the same time, which is an
Yes.
indication that either they're working together or they all at the same time see that the United States is not willing to confront them.
Or both. And a third consideration, which is particularly alarming, is of course all three of those nations have poured immense amounts of money. In the case of North Korea, money it clearly doesn't have into modernizing and greatly expanding the capabilities of these forces. And I mentioned the Chinese minimal deterrence, as we've been told endlessly about. That's over the side for sure. Just these 300 so silos alone indicate that they will have perhaps a force the size of ours, if not larger, in fairly short order. And it really raises this question, and you touched on it just a moment ago, Gordon. The axis that has been formally announced, really, just before the Olympics and the genocide games, as we call them, in Beijing. Talk a little bit about what we know about that strategic partnership between the Russians and the Chinese, and where you think things stand with respect to it in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. Is China, as some have indicated, backing away from Russia to any perceptible degree?
You're referring to a February 4th joint statement of 5,000 words where China and Russia announced their
Correct.
no limits partnership and also said that there was no area which was forbidden from cooperation. Um, we had seen in the first moments of the Ukraine invasion China's full support for Russia. So, for instance, there were elevated commodity purchases that finances the Russian war effort. China put its diplomats in service of the Kremlin. The Communist Party and central government media were amplifying these ludicrous Russian notions. China was making its financial system available to Russian institutions that had been sanctioned by the United States and the West. And also, China was supplying military information to the Russians to help the Russians kill, for instance, Ukrainian drone operators, because Ukraine was using Chinese made drones manufactured by DJI, the Shenzhen based company that makes about
Mhm.
70 to 80% of the world's drones. So this was full support. Recently, we have seen China back away a little bit from Moscow, and I think that's because the Biden administration has put a lot of pressure on the Chinese. But nonetheless, China is still supporting Russia, and indeed, in some cases, has increased the support in the last couple of weeks with these increased commodity purchases. So this is clearly an indication that the two are working very, very closely together, and that we can maybe affect it at the margins, but we are not changing the fundamental nature of the relationship between Moscow and Beijing.
I guess the key question, Gordon, is would you put it past the Chinese Communist Party to be playing a double game? On the one hand, trying to persuade the United States, perhaps in response to this pressure, such as it is, that it's on team, shall we say, with us, opposing this Russian, aggression, while simultaneously engaged in all kinds of support for the Russians, economic, perhaps material in other ways as well, and trying to do it on the lowdown, but nonetheless continuing to demonstrate their support for the Russian
I
regime.
don't put it past the Chinese to try to play a double game, but it's actually worse than that, Frank, because Beijing is basically saying to the US, we're doing this. So what? What are you going to do? And although the Biden
Right.
administration has been right to warn about China, these things, Biden has not actually imposed sanctions on China for its behavior, which is direct material support of the Russian war effort. And as I said, also military support, which is supposedly a red line. So
Mm-hmm.
until the Biden administration actually imposes those sanctions, China is defiant. So it's not a double game, Frank. China is just out and out defiant.
Yeah. When you combine defiance on the one hand, and as you said earlier, Gordon, the sense that they no longer feel deterred from engaging in whatever they wish at our expense. And perhaps that's Taiwan, perhaps that's against other friends and allies and interests of ours in the Pacific. Perhaps it's even against us. Who knows? Some of these threats, as you say, are directed clearly at the United States. Some of their behavior seems to be increasingly aimed at, for example, Hawaii, to say nothing of islands like Guam. These are the things that we desperately need to be clear eyed about, and nobody's more so than you. Gordon Chang, thank you for your time today, my friend. Come back to us again next week if you would. In the meantime, stay well. Next up, we'll be speaking with Todd Bensman about the border and insecurity there and what it means for you. Right after this.